Hello and welcome to Fisher's Class Notes Unit 1, Section 2, Episode 6. Today we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. Our vocabulary: mercantilism, the French and Indian War, of course, also known as the 7 Years' War, even though it lasted for 9 years. The Albany Plan of Union, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin will show up, Pontiac's Rebellion, and the Proclamation of 1763. By the end of this episode, I want you to understand three things. Number one, we've talked about this before, that the Europeans believed they had the moral obligation, the Christian duty to take land from people who were not Christian. They thought that they weren't using the land properly and they needed to spread Christianity and show them how to use the land properly. Two, while many of the tribes didn't want anything to do with the colonists coming in and tried to avoid them, many of them traded, particularly with the French, and tried to have, allied either with the English or the French, whoever they thought would benefit them more. And three, Europeans fought over the American colonies, not just to have a physically bigger empire, but because of the raw goods that would allow them to produce more goods, finished products, manufactured products. That's the idea of mercantilism. Okay, so how did the French and Indian War start? Of course, it's over trade, it's over territory. The British colonies Britain was getting a lot of money from its 13 colonies because all the materials that they were producing, tobacco, eventually cotton, not so much yet, but rice and wheat and cattle and lumber and naval stores and all these things that they were producing. And so they wanted more land and they wanted to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. The France, though mostly the blue, they had that land. But as you can see, there was some land that was disputed, where both the French and the English claimed it. And then same thing, Spain had a little bit of a presence. Most of their stuff was in the Caribbean and South America, but there was some land that Spain and England also were arguing over who owned it. Of course, they're not asking the American Indians who lived there who owned it, they're claiming it. So essentially, France was starting to build more and more forts into this disputed territory, land that France said they owned and land that England said they owned. And so the French, though, were not really colonizing this land. They were mostly setting up forts just to trade with the American Indians, which of course made the American Indians much more likely to ally themselves with them. So the American Indians pretty much traded much more with the French, who weren't taking their land but just trading with them. The French colonies, where they made most of their money and had their slaves, were in the sugar colonies, what they called the sugar colonies, which were the colonies in the Caribbean. So basically, the English wanted to expand west into this land that France owned. Okay, so how did the actual war start? The French controlled land that stopped the British from continuing to settle, and the British colonists wanted that land so that they could continue to push the tribes off and take it for themselves. The British wanted to expand their territory all the way to the Pacific Ocean, so further west, so that they could get more land. Because why? More colonies equaled more resources, which made more manufactured products, which meant more money. Also, the American colonists were not just producing these raw goods, they were also buying back finished products from Great Britain. So they might produce the lumber, cut down the trees, send it to England, so England gets that lumber, and then England turns those into finished products, beautiful chairs or what have you, and then sends it back to the colonies, and the colonies bought it. So they were making money off the raw goods and selling goods back to the colonists. They were making a ton of money. So of course, everything has to do with trade. Basically, in this disputed territory, the French were continuing to build forts. And so actually, the governor of Virginia sends a good friend of his, a Virginian, a very young colonel by the name of George Washington. Yes, the George Washington who becomes our first president and the commanding general of the Revolutionary Army. But George Washington is only like 21 at the time, and the governor of Virginia sends him out near Fort Duquesne, where one of the French forts was, to see what's going on. It was near the Ohio River and near where modern-day Pittsburgh is going to be. But Washington sets up his own fort and then starts attacking the French fort, and basically a battle comes and it snowballs, and thus the war begins. So, meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, yes, the key on the kite guy, he'll come back, of course, again when we talk about the Revolution. He created what is called as the Albany Plan of Union. It's the idea that 13 colonies would work together just in case the French or the Spanish attacked any one of them. Then if they got attacked in the north, then the south would come defend them, and vice versa. So the 13 colonies would work together. Although none of the colonies join or sign off on the Albany Plan of Union, it does get them thinking like, this actually might be a good idea. And of course, they'll think about that later. In fact, this cartoon, which was drawn about the Albany Plan of Union, it gets used again in the Revolutionary War when they're talking about we got to join or die, we got to work together or die. A couple more battles happen. Originally the French were winning, but then 1755, the British take back Fort Duquesne. 1759, the British basically beat the French out of Quebec, which was Canada, and so they start doing really well. The British officially win the war. The Paris Peace Treaty was signed in 1763, giving North America to the British. Now, some of North America actually the French continued to own, which is, of course, the Louisiana Territory, which is not just in Louisiana, but goes further north. And Pittsburgh, where it all started, the Fort Duquesne became Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt turns into where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is today. Okay, so what happened? Well, the American Indian tribes had survived this whole time by paying the French off the British, by kind of playing them off each other. I'm going to trade with them. What are you going to do? You want to trade with me? And so it would be beneficial to them. But now the British had the whole monopoly of North America, and so the American Indians have no choice. Remember also, the French weren't using the land to colonize, just to trade, and so now the British are going to move into that area, and so of course the American Indian tribes are not happy about this. Now, most of the soldiers died of disease, not in battle. For example, Britain lost about 1,000 soldiers to battle, and 5 times that, 5,000 due to disease. Britain gained Canada and had its largest empire, also gained India, which after the American Revolution would become their most prized possession of their empire. France gained the islands in the Caribbean, not all of them, and Spain gained the Philippines, which will come later, and then Cuba became officially Spanish-owned. The Albany Plan of Union, of course, even though nobody accepted it, gets colonists thinking, maybe we can work together. Maybe we start to think about a little independence. Also, the British gain a lot of debt. It costs a lot of money to go to war. The British almost doubled their national debt. They went from about 75 million pounds of debt to 133 million pounds of debt. So they start charging internal taxes, which we'll talk about, on the colonists. Famously the Stamp Act, which of course the colonists are going to get really, really angry about, but it was to pay for the war, which they felt was fought to defend the colonists. Also, the American Indians, they get frustrated because they realize that the British are going to just start taking their territory. So the French gave to the British the land that belonged to them, but of course American Indian tribes live there and feel that the land is for there, mostly around the Great Lakes in around the Great Lakes in what will become like the state of Michigan, and also in Canada and Ottawa and stuff like that. So the American Indians, who are angry, they're worried about the loss of their land. They decide they start a resistance movement. Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763, right after the war, led by Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe. They were unsuccessful, but it did show the British that the American Indians were they were gonna keep fighting to try and keep their land. So the British pass the Proclamation of 1763. After the conflict, they decide we want to stop this conflict with the American Indians, and so they basically call all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So here are the Appalachian Mountains, going from northern Georgia all the way up to Canada. Basically, they said this land belongs to the American Indians. Well, that, of course, makes the colonists very angry because they're thinking, like, didn't we fight this war so that we could have this land to settle? So that's going to be something else that upsets the colonists. All right, thank you for watching.